Okay, there we go. Okay, welcome everybody. I'm delighted to be speaking today with Assistant Professor Vida Yao, who's at Rice University in Texas in the United States. Vida wrote a chapter for the moral psychology of hatred on the topic of self-hatred. And she's speaking to us today from Arizona. Vida, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
So as you know, this week we are reading about love and hate. So your chapter in particular is really relevant because it's about self-hatred, but you root self-hatred in a sort of conception of love. And just to get things started, I was thinking about the ways in which you contrast self-hatred with other sort of negative moral emotions that are directed at the self. So early on in the chapter, you distinguish self-hatred from shame and guilt. And sort of roughly speaking, in shame, I kind of imagine and endorse a perspective from which contempt is directed back at me. And in guilt, I imagine and endorse a perspective from which anger is directed back at me. And then in self-hatred, I imagine and endorse a perspective from which hate is directed at me. I think this is really promising, but it raises the question of how anger and hate are different, because that's the way that you're distinguishing between guilt and self-hatred. Both seem like they're hostile, both seem like they have a negative valence, both can motivate aggression, and both can be in response to a perceived fault or a wrong. So how would you distinguish between these, and how can we then import that to our understanding of the difference between guilt and self-hatred?
Right. So I guess so I would put the proposal a little bit differently. So the thought being that if guilt primarily involves some kind of self-directed hostility, I'm thinking of modeling self-hatred, especially because the piece was really inspired by like an attempt to make sense of this really particular form of self-hatred that I use James Baldwin's novel to illustrate. That the thought would be something like, what's going on is some reaction to how I imagine I'm perceived by this kind of quasi-theoretical construct of an internalized other, where it's not that the internalized other hates me or feels hostility toward me. It's that they don't love me. And so what happens, I'm proposing, is something like, in the cases in which I imagine that they don't love me, and I imagine that there's some kind of quality about myself that explains why they don't love me, that's the thing that gives rise to hostility toward myself in taking kind of accepting a sort of responsibility for having those qualities in the first place. So it's not actually the internalized lover's hostility towards me that I feel. That might be one variant of self-hatred, but like the fundamental thing that I'm trying to isolate is this idea that like you could just take on this image that you have of yourself, feel hostile toward it because you feel remorseful as a sort of a feeling of responsibility for having that quality, and that explains the hostility. Yeah.
So the idea is that this hostility arises from a recognition or a misrecognition of a sort of serious flaw in the self that could be perceived by an other who I want or expect or need to love me.
Exactly. So it's kind of like, and I don't even need to endorse it. And it's also in the way in which it's a flaw, I think can really vary, because it will be so dependent on what it is that I'm imagining could explain their lack of love for me. And so like in some respect, like if we were just looking across, if from some like more general perspective, we were thinking about like character flaws or something like moral flaws or something like that, it doesn't even have to be anything like that. Right. And that's one thing that I really emphasize about how another way in which I think of this is differing from the kind of self-hatred that might emerge from guilt, because it can be all these qualities that have like no real moral or evaluative valence, except that in this particular dynamic, it's the thing that I imagine is explaining why it is the person doesn't love me. So it's like, is like physical clumsiness, like that's a kind of silly example, but let's say like physical clumsiness, is that a flaw? Like in a sense, it's a flaw. But, we could also change the case where it's like something we would think in almost any other context would be like a really good thing, about somebody. Like, what if I am just really ambitious? And that can be a good thing, whatever, depending on other sorts of evaluative commitments that we have. But it doesn't, but like part of what I'm suggesting, like, it doesn't even matter, like in the broader scheme, what sort of evaluative significance that has, if it takes on this particular significance where you're just attributing the lack of love that you're experiencing to that quality.
Yeah, so I guess this is interesting in part because almost no one loves me, right? There's billions and billions of people in the world. Most of them don't know who I am, so they don't love me. And so like lack of love is normal. Most people don't love most people, of course.
And you also don't love them.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
so why is it that the lack of love is felt so keenly in these particular instances? What makes the difference between the lack of love that I get from almost everybody on the face of the earth and the lack of love that leads to something like self-hatred?
Yeah, so I would think in the sort of like normal case, or the case that I'm using as the paradigm, it's your love of the other person, which I think about as being sort of inherent, like an inherently reciprocal desire. So of course we can think of lots of cases where it's like unrequited love and you accept that it's unrequited. But I typically think that, when it's your opening your heart up to someone else and your love of them, that exposes you to this need. And so, yeah, so for the most part, yeah, for other people, it doesn't really matter. I think this is the case with like a lot of our emotions, that in sort of, in the kind of case that I'm really focusing on, it's like it's leaving open this possibility, as I put in the paper, that like you can develop a sense of yourself where you just really don't care about like what most people would think about you. I actually don't know if that's like true. I think social media like makes us really like sensitive. Like we just have this kind of basic natural sensitivity to like what other people think of us. And so I don't want to rule out that there could be somebody, there are people who develop a psychology where they actually just like need the love of strangers, like celebrities or whatever. Like you just start needing that kind of reaction, something that approximates some kind of reaction from them. But again, in the kind of case I'm imagining, it's like, yeah, you can imagine not caring about what other people think about you. But I find it really difficult to imagine that you would be unable to care, again, without even, it's not like any kind of endorsement. It's not kind of like you're giving them any kind of authority, but just the fact that you love them is going to be the thing that makes you vulnerable to their perceptions of you.
Yeah, I see. That's really helpful. So the story that you kind of tell for how this ends up happening draws on Freud, who was a psychologist and sort of amateur philosopher a century ago. And I don't know whether my students are familiar with Freud's sort of ontogenetic story about the emergence of the ego and the superego. So if you don't mind, could I ask you to explain a bit more how he thinks this kind of process of introjecting an other happens in childhood, and then also how it sort of plays out in adulthood?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert in Freud, and there are different interpretations, and he also changed his views over time about how exactly that happened. And so the Freud that I'm using in the paper is sort of like a philosopher's Freud, like it's philosophers and the more contemporary philosophers reading and then interpreting what's going on with Freud. And I guess one thing, so just to contrast with the alternative that I'm offering, so I'll just say, like, I'm very sympathetic with, in general, what we can think of as psychoanalytic approaches to the mind in the cases that we find a person's emotional reactions otherwise really difficult to understand. So I don't rely on it for all of my work, but I think that there are like these interesting emotional experiences that if you were to not rely on something like a psychoanalytic understanding of the mind, and I'll say a little bit more about like the particular things that I'm borrowing from that general approach in a minute. It just does become sort of puzzling. And I think of self-hatred, or at least the kind that I'm interested in, as puzzling just because of this. It's puzzling because like the person themselves might not understand what's going on with them. And they can't, like, if you were to try to reconstruct it just in terms of like, oh, they're just reacting to something in their environment, or they're just reacting to something that they're like accurately perceiving, it's really hard to make sense of like the conflict and the confusion and the disorientation that comes along with some of these emotional experiences. So from the psychoanalytic perspective, one thing that I find really useful is this idea that at some point in a human being's natural development, the way in which we develop is through what we could call a kind of internalization of our understanding of how other people perceive us. And so it kind of can float free from how they actually perceive us, but it starts to form a part of our psyche where a lot of our reactions then are actually informed by a kind of not fully conscious reaction to how we imagine that we're being perceived. So that's partly why I talk about shame in the paper. I think shame is really illuminatingly revealed as a very complex emotion once we recognize that you can feel ashamed without any actual person seeing you in a way or exposing you in a way that would make you feel ashamed. It's really this imagined internal other perspective that that can lead to the experience of shame. And so similarly with self-hatred, I rely on that basic structural possibility within the human psyche. Now, with Freud in particular, Freud is one of the few philosophers or theorizers of the mind that has given us, he provided a really crucial understanding, crucial, and like I think it's shaped a lot of like common like everyday understandings of self-hatred, that something that happens when we become socialized, he thinks, to live among other people, is that we have to learn how to repress a lot of our aggressive instincts that we're just born with. So that's also part of our sort of natural endowed inheritance as human beings, is that we'll have all these aggressive impulses. He later on kind of attributed this to what he calls the death drive. And they needed to go somewhere. And so his view of self-hatred is sort of like, look, you learn these rules of how to get along peacefully with other people. And in order to get along peacefully with other people, you can't just act out all your impulsive, aggressive impulses against them. That would not be a way that you can be socialized into family life and then into moral life. But then this kind of energy, this aggressive energy, has to go somewhere. And he thinks it's kind of like a release valve view of these aggressive impulses. They have to go somewhere, so you direct them back onto yourself.
Yeah.
And that's the story. And he thinks the emotion that, right, as I put it, the emotion that gets expressed by is guilt, and the aggressive side of guilt is punishing myself for having at some level an awareness that I have these aggressive impulses that I now have to restrain myself from acting on, but yet I still am aware that I have them. And so I feel like this guilt of being like a not properly moralized individual. And so though I agree, like I borrow a lot from kind of just psychoanalytic thought in this paper in general, it's that particular view of self-hatred that I'm trying to not say that doesn't happen, but I'm just trying to give an alternative picture to that view, because of the ways in which that view, at least understood in a certain way, I think doesn't make straightforward sense of the kind of self-hatred that I was trying to illuminate in this paper.
Right. That's great. Yeah, so I guess Freud was to some extent ripping off Nietzsche in that theory, where especially in the genealogy of morals, you get this idea in the second essay where Nietzsche says, we had to breed a certain type of creature, this human creature, and that meant redirecting its drives in many cases, especially the aggressive drives. They get redirected onto the self. And then the fact that they still exist and that we realize we have them makes us feel guilty for having them in the first place. So that gets tied up with notions of repayment and with notions of debt, and eventually with the doctrine of original sin and so on, which is, very, very fun to read. I don't know whether as a historical hypothesis it's accurate. So it's interesting to have this alternative perspective on negative self-directed emotion, especially self-hatred, that doesn't necessarily have to draw on Freud or indirectly on Nietzsche. Can you say just a little bit more about how philosophers should interact with these psychologists from decades ago who, obviously have flaws in their theories, both from a theoretical point of view and from an empirical point of view? We're dealing with this in the class a little bit because of the replication crisis.
Oh, I see.
Has affected much more recent psychological research. Because on the one hand, it's interesting and fun and exciting to try to do interdisciplinary work where you say like, oh, what do they think over in this other field? But then it's also very frustrating sometimes because you find out like, oh yeah, nobody in psychology believes this anymore because they've all decided there's no good evidence for it.
Yeah. So I guess, so there's probably a couple different stages to my thinking of the relationship between moral, like the way that I conduct moral psychology or think of moral psychology and empirical psychology, some of which has to do, I guess, with a skepticism about scientism understood as scientific evidence, garnered in a certain way as being the end all of our ability to understand the world. But I'll set that aside. I think apart from the replication crisis and these other issues that have been coming up in the methodology of empirical psychology, I tend to look at a lot of empirical psychology, like even before that stuff happened. I tend to look at a lot of empirical psychology with a bit of skepticism, partly not skepticism where I don't think that there's a way to do it better, but I tend to find that a lot of the concepts that they're using and that they're using in their hypothesis forming and testing are concepts that they either have to just like stipulate in some way that I sometimes wonder whether that really actually matches up to something that human beings on the ground care about and have a sense of. They either stipulate it or they have some concept that is really heavily drawing on a certain theoretical conception of the mind or a theoretical conception of the emotions or a theoretical conception of that particular emotion that builds in a lot of the philosophical content, sometimes without their being aware that it's building in that philosophical content, where I think that a place for sort of moral psychologists of the disposition that I tend to draw from and that I find interesting, that's precisely a place for us to kind of go in there and just try to figure out what are the concepts that we're actually using to try to understand what it is that is being tested for. So, I would suspect that, an empirical psychologist who was studying self-hatred would have to start off with some understanding of what that is. But would not just from my experience of talking to empirical psychologists, engaging with them, about this topic in particular, it would not look like either Freud's conception or the conception that I'm offering, and it might be really simplified. It might be and then there becomes this big question of whether or not we're even really talking about the same sort of thing.
Yeah.
And so again, with the psychoanalytic thinkers that I like to draw on in certain cases, that includes Freud, includes a psychoanalyst, Melanie Klein, who really kind of fundamentally altered her view of what was going on in early infant relations. Again, I tend to draw on that in just those cases where I find the conceptual resources in philosophy, in contemporary philosophy, or the conceptual resources in empirical psychology just lacking. Like I feel like I don't get a satisfying explanation of what's really going on with a person if I limit myself to a lot of the concepts made available in either contemporary moral psychology or empirical psychology. So that's sort of where I place them. And and then there's a big question of like, what has happened to psychoanalytic thought? It's true that like we have all these issues in testing it either as just a descriptive theory or as a theory that can make sense of like the therapeutic benefits that people get from psychoanalysis. So there's all those sorts of difficult questions about how to feel confident in the conclusions that a psychoanalyst draws. But from the general perspective that I take in moral philosophy, which draws a lot on literature, on history, on genealogy, on different, again, I would think of philosophical models of the mind. The level at which they can give me conclusions is one that I feel satisfied with. But I fully recognize that if someone had a different kind of standard, a different kind of epistemic standard here, that that would probably not be enough for them.
No, that's really helpful. I mean, I've done some empirical psychology myself, and I agree with you that in many cases, because you need to develop, say, a questionnaire that has 10 sentences in it that people agree with or disagree with, you end up massively simplifying and arguably oversimplifying things. That's in the context of social and personality psychology, but in clinical, it's also very difficult because your sample sizes tend to be very low. There's always the confound of the therapist. You can't just randomize therapists to therapeutic methods because if they don't believe in what they're doing, they don't do a good job of it. And you have very small sample sizes as well, because even someone who's a very active therapist is only going to be able to see if, a dozen, 2 dozen people a week.
Right.
And so drawing statistical inferences from that kind of sample is extremely challenging and also time consuming.
Right.
Yeah, so I mean, with Freud in particular, it's tricky because we know, he was like a wild misogynist, and he had these somewhat esoteric ideas about the death drive and stuff like that. But then, when you read some of the other stuff, especially the earlier drive psychology and the stuff on introjection and the formation of the conscience and the superego, it's like, oh, okay, there's something to this.
Right. And a lot of, and a lot of the very kind of bigger moves that are made by Freud and, sometimes refined and sometimes abandoned. I mean, you find versions of them throughout philosophical psychology, like some version, right? So like Nietzsche is a great example. I mean, I think Freud, somewhere he wrote something like he was hesitant to even read Nietzsche because he realized that so many of the positions that he wanted to articulate himself were so similar to Nietzsche's that he was worried that he would get them kind of mixed up, and he didn't want that kind of influence because he recognized that similarity, going back to Nietzsche, but then even going back to like someone, to Plato or something, and like the division of the soul in Plato, and any kind of, rich philosophical theory that recognizes that most of what we can't make sense of when it comes to understanding ourselves, understanding each other in terms of the emotions that we feel and the actions that we perform, like just can't make sense on a more simple model of the self, where the self isn't divided. I mean, divided in ways that the self might not understand. I think of that as just being like part of a longer intellectual heritage that goes way beyond and before Freud.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I should pull us back to hatred and self-hatred.
Sure.
So one interesting aspect of hatred and self-hatred that you mentioned earlier in this interview, and then also in the chapter at several points, is that it can latch on to non-moral aspects of the hated person. So people hate each other over race or ethnicity, over gender or sexual orientation, over religious identity, for all sorts of characteristics that seem to be non-moral and in many cases also non-voluntary. And then if I understand the chapter correctly, you think that this is because hatred attaches not so much to fault or responsibility, like resentment or guilt might, but to identity, what makes someone the person that they are, rather than what they've done or failed to do. Is that right? And if it is, why do we so easily fall into such an extreme emotion like hatred over things that people don't even seem to have any control over?
Yeah, I think I would want to be more careful. I would want to be careful and give probably a different account of hatred of other people. And I think there just are a lot of different explanations of why that happens. So just for one of the guiding thoughts in giving this account of self-hatred was just to take it surface level, like reports or what it seems like happens with people, where it is really the case where it doesn't seem like the thing that they hate themselves for is something that they have any moral responsibility for. And so again, like wouldn't be something that, you know, we would think of as naturally giving rise to guilt. I mean, again, I think that that can happen. I think that that is actually Jean Hampton does say a little bit about what she calls moral self-hatred, where that is a kind of hatred that you have for yourself precisely because of some kind of moral failing that you recognize in yourself, a disposition to perform morally bad actions or wrong actions. And like, I guess it was just sort of my sense that like, we have a tendency in philosophy in general to moralize things. And so part of like what I was just trying to do was try to get us to expand our imagination and take more seriously those other quality traits and think like, okay, you know, it's not that those traits, those qualities gain their evaluative significance because a moral system or a moral understanding has deemed them to be flaws. Again, that could be one thing, but it's really this other kind of idiosyncratic thing that can happen where it's like, whatever it is, you know, here's why it gets its evaluative quality. It gets its evaluative quality because it's the thing that you're imagining explains why this either imagined or actual beloved does not love you back.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah.
So this is interesting in a couple of ways because it relates to some stuff that Adam Morton talks about in imagination. In at least two ways, in fact. So I notice in the chapter you have several examples from fiction, especially novels. And one of the things that Morton cautions against is thinking that we can understand the psychologies of actual humans from the psychologies that are depicted in fiction. Not that he thinks that we can never learn from fiction, but that in many cases he thinks what gets portrayed is something that is either unusual or idiosyncratic, or maybe in some cases even impossible for an actual human to embody in their own psychology. And I guess this relates to the sort of flawed epistemology of self-hatred as well, because if I understand your view correctly, you think that in some cases people experience self-hatred because they misimagine that the beloved doesn't, or perhaps even couldn't or shouldn't love them back. So I'm curious what you think about the accuracy or reliability of imagination, both in the person who might be experiencing this emotion of self-hatred and more broadly as a kind of methodology for us to use in moral psychology and philosophy for understanding like what might happen in our minds.
Right. Sorry, one second. I'm just going to close my door. Great. So yeah, so the two questions there. So I would also be pretty cautious about using literature in philosophy. Like I don't, I think the question of when to use literature and how is itself like a really difficult philosophical question. It's not obvious of what the relationship is. And so, you know, for the most part, I do take it that there will be some literature that is psychologically insightful in a way that we might not have other ways. There might not be other ways to express those insights. Even philosophically, there might not be a way to fully express the insights that some authors, I think, genuinely have about human psychology in some literature. So of course, like you kind of sort of have to develop a sense of like who you can trust and who you can't trust to give you what you take to be a realistic, insightful, psychological take on something that's going on. And then of course, it takes your own interpretive resources as well to draw on that insight, you know, and that is just sort of, you know, I sort of just have to assume that the epistemology of that will have to be worked out. I mean, I really do think, like, for example, we would have to be able to take seriously that, for example, Shakespeare understands things about human beings that a normal person would have a really hard time understanding, but could recognize upon understanding, like when he's talking about, again, these pretty intense, sure, unusual cases, that he's using these cases to illustrate a kind of a very particular psychological formation that can explain why it is that somebody's doing something that we would otherwise just sort of think of as like irrational. Like, I think that that's usually not a very satisfying explanation. Like, you know, why can't Othello just get it together? Like, you know, and it's just like, I take that to not be like a fully curious human understanding of another person. And then there will be like rare people that can fill in that psychology in a way where then maybe, yeah, we might never find ourselves in this situation where, you know, we're driven mad by jealousy because we listen to someone and we can't trust, you know, our partner is someone who's faithful or something like that. Maybe we never find that we have that experience, and maybe we find that like all our middle class friends don't have that experience or something like that, but that nonetheless the resources that are in there, the psychological resource that he's identified, can make sense of these kind of extreme variations of psychology, of human psychology. And so that's also why, like, you know, I've been suggesting, like, I tend to not use the psychoanalytic resources until I feel like I need to. And so when you get these really weird cases, like the case from James Baldwin, who I also take somebody who's very sensitive to human psychology, really insightful about human psychology, and so was describing something, and also in a way that was sort of philosophically informed. I mean, he himself was skeptical, I think, of the Freudian understanding of self-hatred, and he presents this character where everybody is confused about what's going on with him, and he's confused, and you know, he's not giving like a philosophy paper, he's just describing it, but in a way that, you know, is rich and real. And so so on that side, that's kind of the place that I'm at in terms of rendering my understanding of the relationship between literature and philosophy and moral psychology. Now, when it comes to this other question of misperception, I mean, what I do think, is just a common thing, a really persistent and common thing, which is that human beings can take up perspectives on themselves and other people that are persistent and maybe just systematically wrong, in ways that, again, I would hope we can explain in a deeper and richer way than just saying, oh, they're epistemically rational, right? Like that's the easy thing you can say. You can be like, look, you know, this guy, he's just crazy, and he can't form reliable beliefs about like who loves him and who doesn't love him. And you could just stop there, but I don't find that satisfying. And I think, you know, that's partly why I rely on the psychoanalytic resources here, where I just think there's something that's driving his persistent attachment to this view that he has of himself, in spite of all the evidence that you could give him.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. I mean, it sort of reminds me a little bit of the opening line in Anna Karenina, where, you know, it's like every happy family is the same, every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. It's like, you know, every rational human is kind of the same, but the irrationalities that we have are idiosyncratic. And just to say, you know, someone's crazy or irrational is really kind of to give up on explaining them, because that doesn't say why they're irrational in this way, rather than any of the infinitely many other ways that they could also be irrational.
Right. Yeah. And I think that, you know, a similar thing can happen also when we're explaining like morally deviant psychologies or morally bad psychology. Like, I don't even know that I would want to use that language. It's like, again, we have a tendency to be like, okay, here's the right thing to do. And if you fail to do that, then you're like a morally bad person, or you're lazy, or you can't will things like in the way that you know you ought to. And yeah, there too, I just think there's just so much more to say, to explain evil, to explain even if we want to use that term, to explain these cases of morally bad or wrongful disposition or behavior as well.
Yeah, that's great. That's really helpful. And maybe it connects a little bit to the two problems that you kind of organize the chapter around, or at least discuss it at some length in the chapter. So you mentioned both the problem of vulnerability and the problem of authority. I take it the problem of vulnerability is more important for your chapter. Can you just say a bit more about what the problem is meant to be? Like, why is it a problem? And whose vulnerability is at stake, and to whom or to what they are vulnerable?
Yeah, sure. So so the problem of authority I just used to set up the problem of vulnerability, because the problem of vulnerability at first can seem like not a problem. And so the idea is something like, okay, when somebody hates themselves, like we can't imagine this sort of aggressive, hostile side. But the thing that I took myself to be, really focusing on, and the thing that I wanted to explain is like, we can't just leave it at this hostile side. Is this what I'm calling a vulnerability to that hostility? So it's not just that you're angry at yourself, or you again feel like kind of negative emotions toward yourself. If we take like the analog being like your relations to other people before we kind of internalize all of it, I'm trying to suggest like that's not a satisfying answer yet, because there's all sorts of hostile actual others whose perspective, again, we're not vulnerable to. Like there's tons of people that you just would not care, even if it's true that they didn't respect you or they hated you or whatever. There's got to be some further explanation of why it is that, first of all, you care in some sense about how the person is seeing you. You would care that there's some kind of hostility, in this case, your own hostility, in the case of self-hatred. And so that's what I'm trying to characterize as like this vulnerability to that perspective. But also in the case of self-hatred that I'm focusing on, it's not just like this vulnerability, it's like he cannot shake this persistence. Like it is so encompassing for him that he hates himself, and that he feels diminished by that hostility. It's not like he feels like resentful toward it. It's not that he's indifferent to it. It's like he absorbs that hostility. And so, on a very rudimentary understanding of like if you had like I'm just as a caricature, for example, like if you had a view of psychology that you were like, basically we're kind of like set up to like pursue pleasure and avoid pain or something like that, then you would be puzzled. You'd be like, why is this guy like subjecting himself to this painful feeling? And he's just like he's so unable to like avoid this painful feeling. It's like he seems to like almost enjoy or want, that's putting it a bit too strongly, but to take up this painful feeling. And that's the thing that I was like hoping that I could be able to explain by the end, with the account of self-hatred that I offer.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So if I understand correctly, the problem of vulnerability derives from the fact that in many cases, we don't care what someone thinks about us. So if I have like nothing but contempt for someone and they hate me, then I just shrug. Or I could even like go further and take a pose and be like, oh, I welcome their hatred. If that kind of person doesn't like me, that's even better. It's like a badge of
yeah,
honor.
that's true. Yeah, totally. But this is like, I accept it, right? I accept it. I accept that they see me in this way, and I feel diminished by it.
Yeah, so what seems to be kind of distinctively terrible about self-hatred, or at least the examples of self-hatred that you're kind of diagnosing in the chapter, is that it finds this vulnerable target, even if the target isn't deserving of hatred. And the background for that is something like unrequited love, or love for either the person or the imagined version of that person, who instead of loving back responds with something like
Indifference,
or
disgust. It could be a host of things that are not the components of like what we might think of as like a loving reciprocal response. And so like so just for this is like the one place that I draw really heavily on the psychoanalytic resources of thinking that like your own sense of yourself as having a certain identity is held up by, partly constituted by, other people's perceptions of you. And so the thought being like, in this kind of case, one thing that can diverge is your need for them to hold up some part of your identity from anything else that you might want from them. So it's like if they're disgusted with you, so that, or if they don't, it's not reciprocated intimacy, it's not reciprocated concern for your well-being. It's none of that stuff that we tend to associate with like the happier sides of love. It's just like this need to hold on to like your identity, even though that identity is one that you also now recognize as not being the thing that, or being the thing that is giving rise to this like lack of love in the first place. And so you get these like this mismatch case where it's like you just need to hold on to that identity because of the role that other people play in crystallizing who we are to ourselves, our self-conception.
Right. So I think this relates to the kind of three types of credibility that you attribute to this internalized voice. So there's the epistemic credibility, definitional credibility, and evaluative credibility. Can you spell those out in a little bit more detail and say why each of them is relevant to this problem of self-hatred and I suppose the problem of vulnerability underlying it?
Yeah, so I was thinking like, you can kind of separate out different cases of these types of credibility. And so we can imagine just like a person, because there's also people they like, so with epistemic credibility, that's just like your sense that you believe what it is that this perspective says about you. And so one way to not be vulnerable is to just be like, that voice has no, that's just wrong. Right. And you can imagine like shoring up your self-esteem by being like, yeah, I know I have, I get this feeling that like maybe I'm like a really bad, I don't know, I'm like a bad mother or something like that. And you can imagine being like, but that's just not true. And you can like tell yourself like, no, I did all this stuff and look at like actually what the ways that I am. I'm not in fact. And this would be a way to kind of not be vulnerable to the epistemic component.
So it's like I have this demon, but I know not to listen to it because it lies
so
to me.
Exactly. So it would be maybe like it's like an internalized perspective that you imagine sometimes, but it doesn't yet have epistemic credibility with you.
Yeah.
So it's internalized, but you're not vulnerable to it. And then you can imagine cases where you might think like, yeah, I'm not a really good philosopher, but like that's just part of that's just one aspect of who I am. And so it doesn't bother me that much because I'm also these other things and those things matter to me more, or they matter to me just as much. So I don't get this like kind of globalized thing that can happen with hatred, where you feel like there's some aspect of yourself that comes to define who you are entirely. And then
the
yeah,
definition part. Yeah.
yeah. So that's what I'm calling like the definitional aspect, where it's like in the contrast case where you're vulnerable, you think like, yeah, it's true of me. And it really defines who I am. It's like the centrally important thing about me that I can't stop focusing on as really constituting as like part of who I am. And then this third thing, this evaluative credibility. And that's the thing that I take myself to be answering with this, with bringing the topic under the topic of love. Like, why would it matter to me? Because there's lots of things that I could recognize about myself, like I'm maybe like, whatever, I could think like, I'm not a very, whatever, I'm not good at doing my taxes. You could even think like, it's actually really important, it's part of like, it's really defining who I am. That's kind of a weird case, but you can imagine something like, it really defines who I am that I can't do my taxes well. I'm like, so just like who I am, but you could be somebody who's like, yeah, and it's kind of like a funny aspect of who I am. I'm so like financially irresponsible and it doesn't really matter to me. So you could shrug it off too. And then so not be vulnerable because of the evaluative significance. And so then I take myself to think like, okay, all right, well then how do we explain the evaluative significance? Then that's where the kind of folding it under this explanation of it, gaining this evaluative significance through your relation to a loved internalized other.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. Well, I have one last sort of point or question that I want to discuss. I realize I'm taking a lot of your time. I hope that's okay. So as I understood in the chapter, the claim is that self-hatred is rooted in the claim that self-hatred is rooted in love is not that self-hatred is rooted in self-love, but rather the idea is something like, when I love someone, I become vulnerable to them in various ways, including ways that involve my conception of what they do or might think of me, rather than what they actually do or might think of me. So they're in a position to know me, perhaps better than I know myself. They're in a position to transform or define me, at least to some extent. They're in a position to offer a verdict about whether I'm lovable in return. And that's what kind of makes me vulnerable. and it can be especially problematic if I internalize a version of them that's inaccurate, or if they're just like a mean person, I suppose, and I internalize a version of them that is accurate. So this could be a case where like my beloved even does love me back, but I've kind of introjected a version of them with different knowledge, different desires, different evaluative standards. And by the standards of the internalized perspective, I'm kind of hopelessly inadequate. Assuming that's the right diagnosis, why is it that we fall into this trap? Why not just accept the sunny evaluation of a real person over the pessimistic evaluation of the imagined one that's only in my own head? Like, what makes us get attached to the internalized voice, especially when we get an external voice that disagrees with it and is allegedly the same person or perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I mean, I take it that it's not like these are, I wouldn't want to say that these always like come apart from one another. And I think that there are cases of self-hatred where it really just actually would in fact be that you hate yourself because of how your actual beloved sees you or hates you. And I think that, the question of how it is that that you get these cases, the ones that I'm really trying to explain, where there's like a real seeming like disparity between the two. I guess there's probably there's like a lot of different things that could explain why that happens. I mean, to the extent that I was thinking about this in terms, so one thing that I say kind of at the beginning of the paper is like we need to pay more attention to kind of the actual contingent circumstances, the actual contingent social circumstances that give rise to our psychologies in a way that Freud can sometimes abstract from by just talking about like a moral system in general as being the thing that gives rise to his conception of self-hatred. So I kind of like, I kind of reference this idea that like we'd actually have to pay more attention to actual social dynamics. And one thing that I don't elaborate on here, but I was sort of thinking that one explanation for why it is that you become so susceptible to this imagined perspective is just because of like other things that are going on in your society, such that the messaging that you're getting from your society is one that will encourage you to fill that imagined perspective with like a certain kind of content. And also for, again, I don't say much here, but like for some reason your sense of yourself and your sense of your worth is in itself maybe perhaps just diminished because of your social standing in a society, more largely speaking. So you just don't feel confident in your standing within a social within your social setting, such that this kind of lack of receiving what you would take, what like someone who might be less concerned about their lovability in general, right? Like, so again, depending on the norms of a society, like there are just facts of the matter on the ground about who is deemed, maybe because for whatever characteristics, who is deemed lovable and who isn't. And if you're part of a group that in your society is not deemed lovable because of the existing social norms, then it may be the case that you just become more hypersensitive to the fact that this is something that's sort of pervasive in your life. And so it can gain this significance for you that it might not gain for somebody who just has more self-confidence, that some idealized, internalized, whomever they imagine they want the love of, that would be possible within the circumstances that they're in. Like it's possible. Like maybe maybe there's no one right now, in fact, who loves me, but I don't feel, I might not feel that down about it, because I just think, it's not really anything about me, and it's just bad luck, and I'll just, go back out there and meet more people. But if you're getting this kind of implicit message that no, it's like something about you, that for, these reasons that really it doesn't have anything, again, you're not morally responsible for it. It's just the society that you're growing up in, that this can be the thing that kind of exacerbates that wound.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So the idea is sort of like probably most or all of us have these demons chattering in the background all the time, but for some of us, they get a megaphone because the culture in which we find ourselves and in which we've grown up is one that sort of amplifies them and says like, yeah, actually this is a voice you need to take seriously, because that's the sort of thing that would in fact make you unlovable. Whereas other people are given a lot more kind of positive feedback and told, you're a good boy, you're a good girl. Of course, everyone's going to love you, or the right person is eventually going to love you. And that makes it much easier to kind of ignore or dismiss the chattering demons in the background.
Yeah, and I think probably, again, just because I don't, it depends on how far one goes into like the psychoanalytic explanations. I would probably even hesitate to be like, there's always the chattering demons for people. And like,
Okay.
I think it's just like, if you have like a strong sense of yourself, like a lot of times it just won't happen that you suffer from these emotional variations that we tend to suffer from in the cases where we feel weak and powerless. I mean, it's like, maybe this is going back to Nietzsche. It's like, not everybody feels ressentiment, like the people in power don't, it's just there's a certain variation, something's kind of almost just, purely historical contingent that picks out some people. They feel diminished, they feel weak. They might, even when we're like, just like physically ill, we can feel things that otherwise we wouldn't feel. And so any kind of like sense of that weakness or diminishment, I think, can sometimes really press on and exacerbate these emotions that they, in such a way that then they take on these forms that are then again like difficult to explain with like just the resources that we would use to explain like the happier cases.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Vida. I really appreciate your time. And this has been enlightening for me, and I hope also for the students.
Thank you so much. I hope everyone enjoys the paper.
Great.